Hello everybody, so just to quickly recap, I have been given the full release version of ANVIL to play early so I can then bring you guys the content on the systems, and in this video we're going to be touching on the different damage types, the elementals, and as well as the functionality of these and why they're important. In my opinion, this is a much better improvement on the previous way that we handled damage in the past, and we'll go right over to the terminal so we can show you that now. So the first things you will notice is if we go over to status effects here, we have our usual status system. Still have our burn, we still have our poison, we still have our bleed, and we still have our freeze, petrify, and shock. Burn is a damage over time effect, so is poison, so is bleed. Burn will deal damage based on your attack power for 15 seconds, and when you upgrade it via breaker skill effects, you will have something called Hellfire, which will increase the duration of burn and make it deal more damage. This can be found on several different breakers within the game and is a much welcomed version of the previous 2 times duration, 2 times damage of the burn that we had in the past. Poison. It's still a damage over time effect, it still does damage based on enemy max health, and it lasts for 15 seconds. This now can also be upgraded to Toxic, which will deal an additional fixed amount of damage whilst over the course of its duration. This is not going to replace the max health damage, this is just an added bonus that we'll get on top of the max health damage. This makes poison a lot more deadly than it once was. It was once already a potent poison for a status element, and it's still a potent status element. Bleed. Enemies receive 20% minus attack speed and movement speed for 15 seconds whilst the bleed is active, and it still also explodes once it reaches its 5 stacks, dealing damage based on max health. You can see up here they also now clarify how the statuses work. You can inflict various status effects with weapons and skills, and enemies afflicted with a status effect will gradually gain resistance and become immune after 5 times. What this means is you will apply, say, a burn once, it will tick for its 15 seconds. Once that burn falls off, that is now the next time you're going to apply it, it will have a diminishing return on the effect of its application, so it will go from 100% duration to 80%, then after the 80% to 60% to 40% to 20%, to eventually they will just become immune to the status system in general. Over to the next set of statuses, we still have freeze, we still have petrify, and we still have shock. For the most part, if you've played this in the past, freeze and petrify functionality is the exact same, and shock is the one that has changed a little bit. So enemy freeze cannot move for 5 seconds. We can extend the duration of this via other systems within the game with stuff like relics and our seasonal upgrade tree. Then we have petrify. Enemies are turned to stone and cannot move for 7 seconds. Petrified enemies are granted plus 50% defense. This is not going to add 50% on to say if they had 30%. Instead, it will take 50% of that 30% and add that on. So for an example here, say the enemy had 30% and then you petrify them, that 30% then will become 45% because of the fact that 50% of 30 is 15, so you just add that 15 onto the 30. This makes it so enemies are not going to be as bullet spongy as they once were, but you'll still feel the damage drop off when you petrify them. Shock. Enemies have their attack power reduced whilst they are under the shock status. This is all shock does now. This does reduce the strength of shock quite significantly, as shock used to also reduce enemy armor, but with how armor functions within the game now, it's nowhere near as powerful as it once was. So it's less important to worry about armor shredding too much unless you're fighting against certain creature types. In my opinion, we'll still probably only use shock for a damage multiplier once we get the relics for it. Outside of that, probably not going to care for it. This is my opinion of what I think they could change. I think they need to bring shock back up to its previous strength where they add the defense shred back onto it. But all in all, the statuses are nowhere near as impactful as they once were, which isn't a bad thing. So to clarify this for new players that don't probably understand why I'm saying that, in the past, in the previous versions of ANVIL, what we used to do was try and get as many statuses as possible, put them all onto one target, and then utilize various relics to increase our damage exponentially. Your damage without elements was much lower than your damage with elements. This has changed within ANVIL now. Instead, you're going to probably cherry pick a couple of elements if you can, and not heavily prioritize on them, so you can just get their bonuses now. in my opinion, much better change to the game, as it allows you to open up your builds to other relics, other things to test, and other things to try out, than having to be shoehorned into one direction with every breaker. If we go over to damage types, this is where the main change of the game happens. This is why these systems need their own videos, and this is where it's now going to be a lengthier. So, in the past, all the damage types were basically just versions of these statuses. Now we actually have our own damage types on our breakers, and if I come over to skill upgrades just to show you what I mean, you can see Jungler has the explosion, and he also has normal, and then we go to someone like lightning, he has plasma, and he also has ion. This is important to know because bosses are affected depending on the damage types you bring. So to start with, we have normal type, also known as void, when you go to certain relics. If I come over to the targets here, for example, you will see that the void target refers to this status symbol, which is just normal. A little bit of a clarification thing that needs to be adjusted. I've given feedback on this, and hopefully we'll see that changed in the near future. But as it is right now, I'll have to call it normal. It deals additional 10% damage to all types. This means no matter what enemy you're hitting with this, you're going to do an additional 10% damage. This type of damage can be seen on various different breakers, as well as on various different weapons, and it's important to note that you can check what are using against what enemy, so you get the effectiveness of this. Explosive deals 15% additional damage to creature type enemies and blocks enemy recovery. If I go over to bosses here, you will see creature type enemies have a high health pool and periodically recover health. This doesn't mean that they're constantly healing in battle. This just means that throughout the fight, they will get spikes of their health back. But if you pair explosive type damage versus them, you will cut that healing out. They will not get their health back. Examples of creature type enemies would be stuff like our pangolin friend over here, Hex, as well as stuff like the various tree type enemies that we've fought in the past, where they sit rooted in the middle of the room, fill the room with various type of AoE effects on the floor, and spawn little ads. If we come back over to damage type, you will see Plasma. Plasma deals 15% additional damage to machine types, as well as deals double damage to enemy shields. This is important because the way shields work in the game now, they're not just a temporary buff that you put on the breaker, they are a permanent effect that is currently active in the game. Once the shield depletes, you have to wait and it will recharge and come back up. You don't have to worry about applying it to yourself via different relics anymore. Same is true for bosses. So machine type enemies, if you come over here, have shields as well as low base health pools. So this means the faster you can get rid of their shields, the faster you can attack their health directly, and the faster that they will die. The fact that Plasma deals double damage to enemies, double damage to enemy shields, means things like Medusa, a crux in the past, is now one of the fastest things in the game. And in general, machines do not feel as tedious as they once did. They are a much more attractive thing to try and fight against, and there is lots of new machine type enemies in the game. I will say that. For example, as a quick sneak peek, there is a Mecha Rhino, and you will see that in one of the demo runs I'm going to do in a future video. As well as we still have Cyclops. There's still things like Destroyer, Machine Commanders, etc. These are all examples of machine type enemies that have shields. If we come down to Ion, you'll see deals 15% additional damage to armor type, as well as ignores enemies' defense. That's right, we have ways of ignoring defense now without needing to have someone like a Sandman in our group constantly. If we come over to boss types, you'll see that armor type enemies are enemies that have armor, as well as bug type bosses as a high defense. So this means that their health values are somewhere between creature and machine, but they have high defense as the way that they deal and mitigate your player damage. But if you have something like Ion in your kit, you will be ignoring that defense and attacking their health directly, so their time to kill will be much more in line with the creature and machine types when you match their elements too. You can still defense shred these with effects like Sandman's Petrified Snipe with his skill upgrades, as well as the various other ways of defense shredding within the game. An example of these armor type enemies will be things like your Protean Beast in the past, as well as things like Polychopper. This is why it's referring to / bug type enemies, as Polychopper is technically a bug. Now, we've covered those damage types. You will see various weapons also have these damage types. All in all, I think this is a great change to the system. Instead of being a one-size-fits-all and you're trying to jam everything onto them, you're now rock, paper, scissors against enemies to try and match the correct element to fight against the correct enemies. This is also in line with how they've changed the game, the pacing of the game. When you're going into places like Cerny, Symphonia, and Campanella, it's much more streamlined. You're going to always face the same type of enemies in those tile sets, as well as you're always going to face the same lineup in those tile sets. What I mean by that is Planet 1 is always going to be the same, Planet 2 is always going to be the same, the bosses are always going to be the same. This gives the player an easy progression path, reduces the variance of RNG, and still brings you a challenge in trying to learn the game and how to use these systems to effectively make your runs easier. Once you get to the new galaxy called Exodia, this is where things change a little bit. They mix in different types of enemies now. You will always have machine types throughout the run. You will always have Medusa, for example. The last boss is always going to be Protean, so that's an armor type, but the bosses in between can be a little different. You might end up having, say, some tree bosses. You might end up having more machine types or more armor types. This helps get the player to learn how to use multiple types of defense shreds or multiple types of damage types to try and counteract each boss individually, and is a much better coat of paint. These are going to be fun to play with. Now for my opinion on this matter, I think it's very good. I think it's much better than the old system. Where they can still improve upon this is maybe change some of the lesser weapons that aren't performing too hot right now to perform a little bit better, to compensate for the fact that you're going to be forced to use those type of weapons when you get to that enemy type. An example of this would be using something like the blink handguns. This is good against shields, but unfortunately the blink handguns just don't have a high DPS. So in general, when you're going to get shielded enemies, you would much rather use like an Indra's or a something like the broker cannons, and just skip over blink handguns in entirety. Same as when you're going against those type of enemies on breakers like Jungler, for example. Unfortunately, your only rifle is Lancer Rifle, so you can't play from a distance, really, unless you're going to use Inferno Shotgun, which is a far better damage profile than the Lancer Rifle. So you end up using this more than anything against those type of enemies, which is fantastic. I will touch on more about the weapons when we get to the weapon video, but for now, this is going to be it for the status video, and I hope this brings insight to what you can expect when you go and play ANVIL for the first time, or when you're experiencing some stuff with these systems.